Hi, I'm Dr. Micah Sellers, and this is Forces of Change.
And I'm Micah's co-host, Annie Graziani. And welcome to the podcast, Micah.
Welcome, Annie. We're going to take an opportunity here to kind of share with listeners a little bit about our backstory, how this podcast came to be, and share some insights from myself and Annie. So let's start out. So Annie, I think our listeners would be interested in understanding your research, the research that you've been working on as you've navigated your doctoral program. Uh, can you just start by sharing what it is that you're researching?
Yeah. So my research is on work-life integration in post-pandemic America with a focus on working parents. And the reason why I chose this particular demographic in this particular moment in time is really focused on, during the pandemic, we had an opportunity to kind of harness what is the place of work in our lives and all the dimensions of who we are, right? We're all multidimensional people. And work seems to have been like becoming more and more consumptive of our time and infiltrating other parts of who we are. And then when the pandemic happened, it really became about an always on culture. But we had a moment there where we had organizational supports to facilitate as best we could to get the work done. And that was with the understanding that there's a lot of other dimensionality going on. We had kids on the floor homeschooling or at the kitchen table with parents next to them trying to get the work done. People were working at all hours, whatever it took to get things done. But for the better part of our professional lives, by the time you get to be sort of that stage in life where you're, supporting others, whether it's aging parents or you're caretaking for other people or children or pets for that matter, you're in the stride of your career. More often than not, you're kind of like in that high potential moment where things can go really fast or, but at the same time, you've constructed life around this lifestyle, right? That we've worked so hard to succeed and to accomplish. But when the pandemic happened, all the things that we thought we could pay for, like the supports that we needed, right? Or just had schools, daycares, nannies, cleaning people, people taking care of the aging family, all this stuff, it all went away. So we became what we probably were already equipped to do is like we became everything for everybody, including for ourselves. And at that time, in the first 3 months of the pandemic, we had like something like 4 million people leave the workforce, 3.5 million of whom were women. And so these facts started to kind of make me very curious about, okay, at the time, mandated return to office, when I started thinking about my topic, mandated return to office was becoming like a hot topic, right? Like, what are we really doing about the expectations of people in the workforce? And what's reasonable? And then, not so long after that, or right around the same time, agentic AI became, generative AI, agentic AI, all this stuff started to coming down the pike, and we're redesigning in some ways like where we're going in our relationship with work. But my question became, how are we doing that and what are the facts that are supporting how we're directing where we're going as a workforce, particularly here in America? And so my interview protocol was really around let's hear from the people, those who are in the work, right? Those who are this is a proximity thing, like those who are actually identifying the problems and really know what they need from the workforce to keep the good people working. And I will quote Annie McKee here because she actually said this, we had a conversation about this. It was like, what does it take to keep the good people in the workplace? And that kind of stuck in my mind. And I started to think about there's a well-being component to it. Another alum from the program said, I'm surprised you're not doing something about well-being. As a yoga practitioner and somebody who, I believe that wellness is really important to sustaining, whatever we have coming our way, whatever we're juggling. Um, so I tried to kind of like figure out how can I write a dissertation or research around all these different things that actually a lot of people are saying they need. And how does that affect the place of work in our lives? And so anyway, that's where the research came from. That's why I situated it around in post-pandemic, but around working parents. So my hope is that by putting some metrics to this research, by saying, okay, this is what it's going to cost if we don't take care of the well-being of the workforce, or this is how the bottom line can, there's an economic impact here to taking care of the well-being of the people. And when we do that, these are the metrics that, so just like ROI attached to anything else, we'll just, research what those metrics are attached to the well-being of the workforce and deliver that back in in a value-based argument. And then maybe from there, we can actually start to shift where our work society is going as far as its structure. Maybe it's not a 40-hour work week anymore. I'm not sure I'm an advocate for 32-hour work week. I'm not saying that either necessarily, but what is it going to become without losing productivity, but with also while, sustaining worker well-being. So that's the purpose of the research.
Amazing. Couple things. It seems to me, that the forces of change, that have been affecting work-life balance have been afoot for quite a while, since probably the advent of the mobile phone, when you have this digital leash where, your management or your leadership can get a hold of you basically at any time. And in this country in particular, we've never really set boundaries, right? And in terms of the separation of work and your personal life, they have these boundaries in many countries in Europe, where management is not allowed to contact workers after a certain hour. That's just not true here, and we all know that.
Mhm.
But certainly, I think since the advent of Zoom and the technologies that really truly enable remote work, the bounding boxes around, when you're working and when you're not were never really clearly defined. And I think, that got exacerbated, during the pandemic. I think a big part of that is a leadership challenge, not really setting the boundaries, between the corporate agenda and, what amounts to somebody's, balance of time.
Mhm.
It's, when you were going through your research, what were some of the key insights that you've been able to drive? And you mentioned something about looking at the reexamination of where we go, based on the findings of this research. You did mention the 32-hour work week. I'd be curious to understand, when you were doing your research, did you look into some of the experiments that are going on in Europe around the 32-hour work week? Because I would argue, what I've read from those studies, productivity actually increases when the amount of time you're spending at work decreases. There's a certain amount of balance, in the like Japanese wabi, right? Between, when you're working and you're getting to the point of burnout, right? When the return on the amount of time you're putting in actually decreases, productive outcome. You know, why is it in this country that we're so focused on, not just the job description is always 40 hours, but the further up the leadership ladder you climb, the less likely it is that you're putting in 40 hours. It's more like 50 hours, 60 hours, 70 hours a week. But I would also argue that there's a diminishing return to that.
Mm. I mean, I think you're completely right about that. And the research is showing that, there's an exhaustion component here. And as you do kind of, climb the ladder, so to speak, or whatever that looks like, yes, people are burning out faster than ever. My chair, Dr. Candy Weens, actually is, one of the leading experts on burnout. And so it's pretty interesting to understand, um, like, yes, exactly what you asked. Why is our society sort of like, why is this our practice? And this is the reason why I feel the need to attach it to metrics, right? Like actual financial metrics. If we can say you're burning people out and they're leaving this fast, or they're disengaged and they're not optimally producing because they're so tired, or because they're not interested, or because the vision isn't clear, they don't know why they're contributing to this particular initiative or this year's, goals or whatever it is. So I completely agree that it's a leadership. I mean, there's much to be said about transparency at the leadership level and what that means to the workforce, and then sharing that there is, some part of what my research has discovered is that there's autonomy, trust, and flexibility for the workforce. So autonomy, I mean, we're hiring good leaders know, mostly the good leaders know that they are complementing their own talents with the exceptional talents of others around them. And when we trust them to execute their talents in contribution toward a bigger vision that is shared by the organization, so that everybody knows that we're all rowing in the same direction, right? Then those who are actually doing the work, not to say leaders are not doing the work, they're doing their contribution of the work, right? It's all contributory. um, but those who need to understand what their purpose is in that organization starts to relate actually to human purpose too. So I think that's partly lacking as well. And I think this came up as part of your question too, is like, why are we like this? Like, what is it about our society that tolerates this? And it's like, I think there are a lot of forces actually. I mean, pun intended, right? There are many forces that are contributing to why we're entrapped by this sort of culture in our work society. And I think that it has to do with cost of living. I think it has to do with dependencies, these material, kind of optical kind of metrics of success. I call it stuff success. And it's sort of like that's all nice to have. We all know what it feels like to get there, but there's a moment when it can actually drift you from your purpose and your contribution. But if leaders are also not centered around their intrinsic fulfillment or their inner mastery of what the work that they've done to get to where they are, and respect that others are just doing all the same thing. What are the common human goals? Like, what are we all really doing in our contribution to society in our but decades that we're here on this planet, right? If we kind of continue to drift from that realization or those awarenesses, that self-awareness, then it's easy to get trapped in this cycle of something that you can technically measure. That doesn't necessarily mean it speaks to intrinsic fulfillment or satisfaction though. Yeah.
I'd be curious, in your interviews,
Mhm.
have you found, uh, an impact, relative to culture, an organizational culture, in how these companies are addressing work-life balance, how they're addressing remote work, how they're addressing, the decision to allow, employees to work remotely or choose to go to the office? Because I would think that the corporate culture and values, play a huge role in that, and it would be very different from a culture that, is human-centered, to one that
Mhm.
is really focused on, just making sure that we hit the numbers, we hit the targets, we're hitting our our quarterly earnings report. The analysts are gonna love us, we're gonna make our numbers.
Mhm. Culture is at the heart of it all, actually. So, yes, and I've actually the people of the organizations that I've interviewed, I didn't do a case study, so I wasn't like going into any one particular organization and trying to understand what worked or didn't work. I thought about going that route. I didn't. Instead, I interviewed across a variety of different organizations. And what's become clear to me is that it is actually easier than you might think, right, to cultivate embed a new culture or embed the foundations of what the culture was. It's not as hard as we might think to kind of cultivate that inside of an organization, but it does take listening to what the people are saying they need to never leave, right? It's like there's an author named Joe Mall. He talks about in his book called Employalty about the destination workplace, and it's pretty interesting because he talks about what is it about certain organizations that just churn people out, right? They're just like a revolving door. And why do people go there if they know that that's the behavior? And it's usually like for all those other factors, right? Like the stuff success or like money or whatever. And we think that's going to work until we're burned out. And then we go look for culture. We look for an organization that shows mutual respect between what we're doing here and there's clarity to the shared vision, right? Like we know why we're all here and we choose to stay at that place because we're taken care of as adults. I mean, it's really kind of like mutual appreciation for the unique contributions that we're all making to the same shared goal. And when that becomes part of the culture or the culture kind of emerges because of that being sort of like the ethos of the company, then you're less likely to lose people because there's something everyone's working toward that also serves the soul, so to speak.
Yeah, it's always funny when you look at the organizations that, have slightly toxic cultures, but, their earnings are really high, they're churning people out.
Mhm.
It's not binary, right? Like, it's not one or the other. It's not you can, build a human-centered culture that values people,
Mhm.
that values their contribution, that rewards them, in a way that demonstrates that, or, you know, grinding them down and churning them out. Like,
Mhm.
it's not a binary decision.
I mean, this concept or this sort of mantra that like everyone's replaceable is damaging because yes. And so my argument is that yes, everyone's replaceable. That's for sure. There's plenty of talent out there in the world, right? But it's at a cost to your organization. And so that's the argument. I think that's the value-based argument that I'll be making through, I'm building my practice to do exactly this directly based on my research. And why that matters is um, because I don't think we can move the needle unless we're making an economic argument, but, the well-being of the people really matters. So, drawing this relationship between leadership and the people and the bottom line, right? So,
Fa Fantastic. Are you
thank you.
planning on translating your doctoral dissertation into a book at some point?
At some point, yes, and so, but I think it'll take a little more time for me to I'm in the middle of coding right now, so I'm actually close to the end of that, which is going shockingly a little faster than I expected. So I'm a little kind of like trying to figure out what am I missing, but but I've got an enormous amount of data. It's coming together. I'm hoping to defend by in and around mid-April, and then I think sometime after that, after the dissertation is officially published, probably within a couple of years after that, I'll be able to convert this to a book. But yeah,
Well, that's awesome. I'm really looking
thank
forward
you,
to May and to being there when you get hooded as
thank
Dr.
you.
Annie Graziani. That'd be an amazing experience.
Well, thank you so much. Okay, Micah, your turn. So let's talk about your dissertation work, and then I would also like to hear about your book and its relationship to your dissertation.
Sure. So when I started thinking about what topic I wanted to research uh, to get my doctorate, I bounced all over the place. I started out in one lane. I ran into a bunch of blind ends and had to turn around and go back. And I finally landed on studying the efficacy of executive education for the development of emotional intelligence in leaders. And the reason I chose that was back in 2016, when I was the chief digital officer at Graphic. I had the privilege of attending the Wharton Advanced Management Program, and it had a huge impact on me, as a leader in terms of developing my emotional intelligence, developing my leadership capacity. And I had started to kind of informally survey, some of my peers from my cohort at AMP, and a lot of them were sharing that they experienced similar transformations through the
Mhm.
program. So I really wanted to understand, was my cohort unique, right? Because the chemistry of a cohort can have a lot to do with the outcomes. We know from adult learning, we learn from adults more so than we do sometimes in training is transfer, right? The dialogue that you get in between sessions often is more valuable than the session itself, in terms of really kind of breaking the topic down, finding the key insights in the material. So I shared this with my chair, who was Annie McKee. My goal to study this, and I initially wanted to just focus on AMP, and to actually follow a group through their program from beginning to end. And that was basically kiboshed immediately by Wharton. They certainly didn't want anyone studying the program that directly. So what I ended up doing was looking across AMPs. I knew people from the Harvard AMP, from the Columbia AMP, from the Wharton AMP. So I gathered a pretty significant list of interview subjects, and most of them in the C-suite, very senior level executives, and you know put my study together. And what I found, through my research, was, one, we know that emotional intelligence is a developable skill. Um, the question is how. What really helps you to develop emotional intelligence, and looking at adult learning theory and looking at experiential learning theory. What I found was, these programs have a combination of elements. There is some training as transfer. A lot of them have seminars, lectures, where you're going to sit in a big room and hear from an amazing professor, or from somebody in a leadership position in a Fortune 500. And while those sessions are valuable, what really transforms people are the more experiential elements of these programs. And another fact that I found was that duration matters, right? The level, the length of training really, really impacts outcomes,
Mhm.
as well as being residential, being in person, in the program for a period of time makes an impact. What I felt that was really unique was that when you combine these elements, experiential learning, when you combine reflection, right, individual reflection, peer reflection, the reinforcing value of that, right, is huge in terms of the outcomes, in terms of being able to develop EI competencies, whether that's self awareness, self regulation, teamwork, collaboration, your ability to understand and acknowledge the emotions of others. For example, in a lot of these programs, they'll have experiential learning events where you're being put into a situation that you're not accustomed to. For example, in my AMP, we went to the New York City Firefighting Academy, and most of the executives, right, had never been in that kind of a situation. You're putting on the fire gear, you're going into a few hours of hose training, and then they're throwing you into a building with a fire, and you got to put it out. A lot of these executives were never in that kind of situation. So being put into that situation, being taken outside of your comfort zone, all of a sudden you're tested, and your emotional response to the situation, how you communicate with others, all those things start to manifest. And then it's the post post learning debrief, right? Where you're debriefing with your cohort coach, when you're debriefing with your peers, when you're reflecting on it, and then maybe a week or two later in another reflection session, going back to that and starting to to pull on the threads of what you learned. Those are the kinds of learning scenarios, learning situations where people really make change. And you know I think all too often leadership training, in particular, right, focuses on hard skills. You know, how can we develop a better framework for developing and executing strategy, right? How can we develop a better framework for how we take the company to market and generate income? Very few programs focus on what people call soft skills, which are really truly not soft skills. They're critical skills.
Mhm.
Emotional intelligence is a critical skill, and I kind of broke it down as I was going through my study into two kind of groups. uh, one group is what I would call power skills, right? Power skills being emotional intelligence, moral and ethical discernment, and then generative skills, your ability to innovate, your ability to collaborate, your ability to drive organizational change and transformation, and to foster organizational culture. And as I looked at my study, one of the things that kind of really stuck out at me in my findings was that, you know, yes, these programs can absolutely develop emotional intelligence. They're not all equal. And the ones that really reinforce that component of experiential learning, that really reinforce peer learning, and that really embrace coaching as a mechanism to drive individual change, are super successful at creating emotionally intelligent leaders. As I wrapped up my doctoral studies, agentic AI was really starting to really accelerate, hyper accelerate. The
Mhm.
adoption of AI was starting to hyper accelerate, and uh, b- before I took my sabbatical to finish my doctoral dissertation, I was working in AI transformation. And I was seeing a lot of challenges there, that were beginning to be manifested in a lot of the organizations that I had interfaced with recently. In conversations that I'd had with executives, that I had as research, as a part of my research. And it occurred to me that maybe I could use that network that I had developed, for my research, to kind of go back and ask some critical questions around leadership, AI, and how these organizations are making decisions, not just about how AI is implemented within the organization, how we look at, the potential automation of roles, whether it's in HR, finance, sales, marketing, et cetera, but
Mhm.
also how they're developing their own AI products. Because there's a huge component there that requires emotionally intelligent leadership. As an example, let's say you're developing an AI system, that is going to be used for customer success, right? And your AI team, that's developing this, is predominantly white and predominantly male.
Mhm.
And the decisions that they're making, about how that system is going to be designed, architected, designed, and implemented, is all coming from one group of individuals with probably pretty shared similar experiences in terms of their background, in terms of their upbringing. but your customers are much more diverse, right? You're not taking into consideration, how this might impact the BIPOC community, how it might impact, a neurodivergent community, people who are going to be interfacing with it. So, from a leadership perspective, the choices that we make as we assemble these teams to design, develop these systems, we need to take diversity, equity, and inclusion into consideration. But it takes some self-awareness, some organizational awareness, some empathy, right? In terms of empathetic design to really understand that. And I think it's important that the leaders that are in these roles have incredibly strong emotional intelligence. In particular, as leaders are being co-piloted, right? By by AI decisions.
Mhm.
And then we look at, the rollout and deployment of AI and a lot of these kind of decisions that are being made at the board level. We have 150 people in finance today. If we implement this AI system, this agentic system with automation, we can reduce that right to 50, right? So X number of people to X number of agents, right? As a collaborative team. There's a human cost to that. There's an organizational cost to that. You know, it takes emotionally intelligent leadership to make the right decision. What is not just right for the organization, what's right for society. What's right for the people who have, you know, poured their lives into this organization.
Mhm.
So that's what kind of led, from the research to my book. And one of the things I found when I wrote my book, going through all those additional interviews is that, one, you know, EI think is probably the most critical skill in leadership today. Um, combined with moral and ethical discernment, and then those soft skills become critical, right? They become essential, to the success of the organization. And it was interesting. The vast majority of the leaders that I had conversations with prior to writing my book, AI and digital transformation and the cost, the impact of that was what was keeping the vast majority of them up at night. And
Mm.
the critical decisions that they either were making or they knew were on the horizon, were the ones that were really challenging to them. Another thing I found as I wrote my book was that emotional intelligence can become the organizational operating system. The and there's a top down, bottom up kind of component to that, right? If you don't have really emotionally intelligent leadership teams who are fostering that and fostering that with their downline and then their downline to their reports, it's not something that's going to happen organically, right? So I think organizations that focus on hiring, right, emotionally intelligent leaders and fostering emotionally intelligent leaders within their organizations are the ones that are not only going to be the most successful in the future, but they're the ones who are succeeding now.
I'm thinking about emotionally intelligent people within an organization who are also not at leadership, right? Like they might be managing certain teams and they're emotionally intelligent, but they may be and they may be equipped to even train emotional intelligence within their teams. But if there's a disconnect between, let's say, you've got some placement of people that are highly emotionally intelligent, right? And then you've got leaders who just like are pushing for metrics, right? For like performative metrics. Go ahead. I'd love
I
to hear your thoughts on that.
actually is one of the things that kind of inspired me to write the book. I'm not going to name names, to protect the innocent and the guilty at the same time. But I recently worked in an organization that was pretty toxic.
Mhm.
Really toxic, actually. Had a high rate of churn at the deck plate level. For employees, just people revolving door, right? And even at the enterprise level, when you're looking at like their sales organization, for example, they were churning. The average tenure of a sales executive there was about a year and a half.
Mm.
And I was hired in a consulting capacity, working on the technology team, and the leader that I had, that I reported up to was incredibly emotionally intelligent, just an exceptional leader. Um, and he abstracted our entire division from what was happening right at the top level of leadership. So we very rarely had to interface, with people in the C-suite. He did that for us, but so it's kind of sheltered, right? So to your point, he fostered an incredibly supportive environment within our division. Um, but then when he left,
Mm,
I was transferred because they dissolved the entire division. I was transferred to another division, and it was remarkable. It was like black and it was like going from full color to black and white in the blink of an eye, and
mm,
it was so shocking, how toxic the organization was and how much I had been abstracted from that because I worked for such an emotionally intelligent leader, who
mhm.
fostered an incredible culture within our division that I left within 2 months of me being reassigned and
Sure.
to a new leader who was absolutely not emotionally intelligent. He had no self-awareness, no empathy, very little, self-regulation, and, it was just every day coming to work was just painful.
Right. So Micah, let's wrap this up. Talk to me about forces of change, where this came from, and it's your brainchild, right? I'm your co-host. This has been an excellent journey so far. So much fun, so much learning. But where did this all sort of, what triggered it in your mind?
So, Annie, over, like, the last couple of years, what's really, struck me is there's so many forces of change right now in the world, that are just not just transforming society, but have the potential to really change the nature of humanity over the next 5-10 years. We I talk a lot about AI. AI is just the tip of the iceberg, right? AI robotics, are going to change the very nature of work, in good ways and bad, right? In the years to come. But there's also a lot of political forces afoot. There's a lot of policy changes that are afoot that are going to make this world either amazing or transform it in ways that are unimaginable. And so what occurred to me is, I would love to have conversations with people around topics like, climate change and the intersection of technology. How could AI be used, for example, to develop new models, to develop solutions that can help us adapt to climate change? We're looking at, the affordability is on everybody's mind, and you mentioned it yourself, right? Everybody's working, 24/7 to try and just make the ends meet. Where are we going in the future when it comes to, universal general income, right? Especially when we think about things, for example, like robotics and automation replacing jobs. What happens to people when they're displaced, right? We're looking at, we've seen, social media, have amazing impacts and also very deleterious impacts. We're seeing, right now on Capitol Hill, a lot of conversations around the mental health impacts of social media on teens. So there's so many forces right now at play that we need to have really smart conversations with really smart people and get their insight, and hopefully, I don't want to bring my perspective. What I'm hoping to do here, and I think you agree, is to take a journalistic approach to bring the smartest people on the most important topics to forces of change and simply ask them questions. Let them share their thoughts, their insights, and then allow the listeners, to make come to their own decisions, and hopefully affect how they show up, right? How they show up in their own advocacy, how they are informed when it comes to making decisions at the ballot box, and how maybe they choose to live their lives.
All right, Michael. Well, thank you so much. This has been incredibly informative. I'm so glad to be a part of this podcast and sharing this journey with you. And I guess for our listeners out there, we'll see you at 8 o'clock on Monday morning.
Likewise, Annie. Thank you.
Thank Thank you for listening to Forces of Change. If you found this conversation valuable, follow us at forcesofchange.fm and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Until next time, keep questioning and learning about the forces of change among us.